Hello, and welcome to The Forgotten King, an audio drama presented by Story Games. Let's tell a story.
Metal clanging against metal always sounded different when it bounced off of stone walls. Kyla Aaron preferred how it sounded outside, like a bird chasing the sun. In the sword room of her father's castle, where her two potato sack oaths for brothers banged away at each other like two trees battling in the wind, the sound was loud and annoying.
Not so carelessly. It isn't just hacking away at your opponent, it's an art form, for Shire's sake.
Malar Nightbringer sang from against the wall, watching his students. Quintus and Protos didn't seem to hear his words. Next to Malar, King Gale Aaron watched his sons, somewhat amused, but not overly so. His offspring were good, undoubtedly, but he hadn't yet seen the greatness he knew was needed to make master swordsmen. And there was Kyla. She was perched like a cat high upon the windowsill. Behind her was a grand window, stained with glass, depicting a beautiful stone spire that shot from the sea, and a man and woman standing on opposite sides of its flat summit. Lightning filled the cloud above the woman, blue fire behind the man. "You boys are like two hounds fighting over a hare's shank," Kyla offered to the room, adding to her father's observations and Malar's unsatisfied glare. "Shut up, Kyla," Quintus replied between thrusts. "Girls don't know anything about fighting," Protos added. He backed up, sidestepped, and lunged with his training sword at his brother's left side. Quintus was the oldest brother, tall and strong, with flowing brown hair the colour of a robin's nest. He was muscular and gentle, the kind of man women fancied and men gravitated towards. Protos wasn't half bad himself. He was a prince of Ironhall, not to mention the quality of his eyes, teeth, hair, and, well, everything. He was a proud boy, always trying to prove himself. A 6- and 10-year-old trapped in a 9- and 10-year-old's body. But he was coming along. "Not the girls you spend your time with," Kyla cooed as she hopped to the floor. The king couldn't help letting a chuckle slip. Quintus threw his arm and sword out to his side, calling off the mock duel with his brother. "What does a little princess know of the knightly tendencies of the future king?" "You sound so gallant when you call yourself a future king. The common folk women and the maidens at the court must eat it up with a spoon." "Father, why do you bring her to these lessons?" Quintus deflected to the king. "She asked to come. Besides, knowing how to wield a sword is a skill all Aarons should know." King Gale stifled a yawn. He hadn't been sleeping well lately. Kyla stepped onto the training circle, painted deep blue with a raging, rusty red fire marked in the middle, the sigil of House Aaron, with a laugh. "It's because I've learnt more from Malar watching you two Adalacs smack each other with those sticks the last 2 months than you could learn in 2 years. A small wooden stand housing the training swords practically tossed a weapon into her hand. "And I'd like to prove that to you, and to Father and Malar, right now." Quintus and Protos didn't know whether they should laugh or take guard. "You aren't serious," Quintus said. "As serious as the takers of tech." She smiled and took a stance. Protos let out a laugh. "You're not even 10 and 7, you little cat. Even if I took you half as serious as you're claiming to be, I'd wager half a week of chores that you can't land a single blow on Quintus." "I see the confidence you must have in the bet. As you placed Quintus' sword in the challenge instead of your own?" No, I mean, I could do the challenge as well. I just think he should carry out the duel. If I competed, it would be a conflict of interest." "So you'll stand over there then?" Kyla gestured to the wall behind him, outside of the ring. Protos nodded. "Is my wager accepted?" Kyla bowed, half mockingly. "We have an accord." Protos leaned towards Quintus. "Wallop her good for me, will you?" Quintus nodded and turned to his sister, a lingering look of puzzlement still resting on his face. "I still can't tell if you're being sincere, Kyla. Will you truly try to hit me with that sword? You can barely hold it up." Kyla studied the dull blade. "Just because it's heavier in my hand than yours doesn't mean I don't know how to wield it." You don't have any armor on. I don't want any armor. But if I hit you, it could cut you. I'd better not get hit then. Father, Quintus turned to him for input. What? Are you going to allow this? Honestly, I'm curious to see the outcome of Prodos's wager. The king smiled wryly. I have a question. Kyla's eyebrows bounced with the remark. What? Quintus asked. When can we start? Well, let's just... Oh! Kyla leapt at him, bringing her sword high and then down on top of his head. She didn't think the blow would land. Her brother was far too quick to be caught off guard from that distance, but she was surprised at how fast he got the defensive angle of his blade up to meet hers. Kyla turned the momentum from the downward thrust into a spin on her knees. Her practice blade slid off his, whirled, and rotated toward his calf. Quintus lifted his right foot up, letting the blade duck underneath, then kicked his sister in her right shoulder with his ironclad boots. Kyla rolled and was up on her feet in an instant. I told you she was a cat, Prodos said from the shadows. Kyla leapt again, kicking her right foot out and jabbing her right hand forward, extending the tip of her blade into Quintus's space. He leaned back, dodging the blow, and brought his sword up to meet her advancing blade. Their two swords rallied and spun, met and parted, metal beating together so quickly it felt like a melody of glancing attacks and blows. King Gale's eyes glimmered with hope as he watched his son and daughter spar. A smile slipped onto Malar's face as he watched Kyla's movements. Come on, lass, he whispered under his breath. Amid the madness, Kyla focused harder still, concentrated deeper. The details of each second pulled her deeper into herself, the breath in her lungs, the burning fibers of her muscles. It was like she was approaching the edge of a cliff, but instead of darkness down below, there was a deep, white, hot power waiting for her. Just before she felt her conscious jump, she saw an opening in Quintus's guard. She raised her knee to stop the wrist of his sword hand from dropping and used the hilt of her sword to move her brother's blade away from his body. It was all she needed. She lunged diagonally left into a low, one-legged squat as her blade turned and penetrated his guard. This left the Princess of Arrenhal only slightly out of breath and in a trance-like state of concentration. Her blade rested across her brother's breastplate. It had been her choice to stop the delivery of her sword's blow. The message was clear enough. She let the second linger, not to be boastful or proud, but simply to gather herself and stand. She allowed her chin to lift as she met her brother's eyes. There was anger in them, sure, but she saw the slightest hint of admiration as well.
Well, I'll be a frog jumped in a fish's mouth, if that isn't the most unexpected thing I've ever seen.
Malar Nightbringer blurted from the side. Indeed, it was, the king agreed, just loud enough for Malar to hear. Kyla walked back to the sword stand, eyes flitting to Prodos. The kitchen pots and the horses won't enjoy your company as much as mine. She smiled as she drifted out of the room, leaving the men's mouths gaping. Quintus considered what had just happened, then let his eyes find his brother. Not a word of this to anyone. Prodos shook his head, only slightly less embarrassed than his brother. King Gale stood from his chair and crossed to his sons. Swordsmanship isn't just about strength and technique. It's about patience and observation. Kyla focused her attention on the will of her opponent, rather than the force of her blade. You boys have much to learn, but we'll master this in time. One day, you will be great knights of Arrenhal in the circle of the king. I pray a battle doesn't come before my time in Eldaron is done, Shire willing. But if it does, then you must always look after each other in a fight. You fight together. Let your hearts burn as one fire, casting the heat of your flames onto your enemies from the back and front. The king studied his sons. Learn well from Malar. Study his ways. Master his art form. But always be mindful of the most important job a true swordsman has: to protect the ones you love. He patted the boys on the shoulder, letting his eyes sink into them for a second longer than he normally would at the end of a conversation. I will not fail you, Quintus said. I'd like to try again, Prodos added, turning to grab a sword. You have half a quarter. At turn of day we leave for Greenlake Forest. What in the world are we going there for? Protos asked. We are going to see my sister, the king replied, leaving his sons confused. Gale crossed his arms behind his back as he left the sword room, but Quintus didn't let him get away so easy. But you don't have a sister, Quintus shouted shortly after. Not one you know about, Gale hollered over his shoulder before his head was out of sight in the stairwell. Do I have to go? Kyla said, crossing her arms and leaning against the stone wall of her room. It was a pleasant enough space, with high cylindrical ceilings and natural tree branches worked into the process design. The spiraled woodwork was masterly crafted wood from a summer oak, bent and tempered to form walls. 2 wide windows graced the east and west sides, and a large chest sat at the end of her bed. It was formed from a tree her father had cut down in Greenlake Forest, dragged back to Arrenhall, and had the smiths and tinkerers in town finish into a keeper of finer things she preferred to keep hidden from the world. I wasn't asking if you wanted to, as much as telling you we are all going. The king walked into her room with his hands behind his back. You never asked me to go to the woods with you and the boys. This is true, but we aren't going hunting or trapping this time. We have a rather different errand. Such as? I do not wish to tell you. Then I do not wish to come. Like I said previously, your doings and not doings are not yours to decide alone. So I am a prisoner? She joked. She could tell he liked it. She always felt that he loved her the most of the 3 Arryn children. Far from it. I wonder how many princesses feel imprisoned in their castle. Should I send a messenger hawk to the other kingdoms to see if you are alone in your angst? That's not funny. It's a little funny. He smiled as he tightened a leather strap in his hiking boots. You want me to come along so I can protect you from any monsters roaming in the woods that Quintus and Protos can't defend you from. Her father stood slowly, letting the jab ring out into the space above their heads. It soaked into the wood crossbeams above, and as it dissipated, Kyla knew she had made a mistake. What happened today must never leave that room. Do you understand me? He rose and stepped towards her. The temperature in the room was much different suddenly. Your brothers are to be the fearless knights of Arrenhall. Quintus to be the future king. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his eyes burrowing into hers. If that image shatters, then so does their armor. So do the Arryns. I understand. What you did today was magnificent. I wish half the king's circle had your natural talent with a blade. Maybe I could join the king's circle one day. You used to say that as a little girl, he smiled. And I say it to you now as a woman. Kyla stood a little taller. I think your role in Eldaron will be far greater than spending your days protecting me. He passed her, making his way to the door. I'll see you at the stable at half-day. What should I bring? A travel cloak and your sturdiest boots. The forest floor will be wet and uneven where we're going. Very well. He made to open the door and leave the room, then stopped. Kyla? Yes, my king? Pack your sword. Kyla searched the room as if a riddle were written on the wall. I don't have a sword. You have one in your chest. She stared at the present he had given her on her 11th name day. The one you got from the smithy down in the middle quarter that no one was supposed to know about. Kyla smiled. Oh, right. Forgot about that one. Good thing you have a chest to keep the things you forget about. Best gift I ever got. He smiled at her in the way that only a father could smile at a daughter. I'll see you at the stables. A short time later, the king's small company made their way north to the ever-glorious Greenlake Forest, which lay just beyond the castle of Arrenhall and the city limits surrounding it. It was a well-sized kingdom, not the largest in Eldaron, but not the smallest by far. Can we at least hunt some small game near the trail as we ride? Protos asked as his horse carried him along. You do well to keep your eyes on the trees and your wits about you, lad, a bearded man holding a spear said from behind him. Joining Kyla and her family was the King's Circle, a group of blood-sworn warriors who King Gale appointed into his service to protect his life. The current circle was made up of 7 men and the king. There was Sir Alarin Red from Vorum in the southeast corner of Eldaron, Sir Dallo and Sir Retic Helmond from the cold mountain city of Dormith. They were brothers, widely known for the 2-handed greatswords they'd used to cut turned men and women in half during the Great War of the Second Age. They led a mounted charge behind Gale and other soldiers that ended the battle. There was also a spearman from Piketown who could thread the eye of a needle with the point of his long spear, named Sir Liam Glow, a dark-skinned assassin named Sir Cian, who didn't have 2 names like the others. And the last 2 men were from Arrenhall itself, Sir Halton Reed and Sir Melek Reach. They were broad men with big chests and forearms.
Will you at least tell us what we're going to do when we get there?
Prodos whined again. The king didn't turn round. If you complain again, even passively, I'll make you walk the rest of the way, Prodos. I wasn't complaining. I was asking a question. Complaints often come in the form of a question, I've found. That was Zorion, the seer who often gave the king important counsel in dire times. He'd been with the Arryns for as long as Kyla knew, and yet he hadn't aged a day. Maybe he hadn't even aged a moment. Zorion was what most would call a wizard or spellcaster, but his order handled the studied and use of magic a little differently than the others in the world. They believed that to truly see the greatness of Eldaron, to absorb its knowledge and harness its power, one must give up the use of his or her eyes. In doing so, it is said, they discover a more spiritual way of seeing. But there were only a few in the world who had the courage to make that sacrifice and take that leap of faith. Some said it was Manon's will to see someone give up their eyes in exchange for dark magics and evildoings. But Kyla did not think it to be so. In fact, she had spent hours studying with Zorion in his library, learning ancient histories, battles won and lost, and whispers of magic. She believed Zorion was a positive force in the world, that the very core of him was good. Blessed by Shire, though perhaps Father Tech and Manon had influence over him as well.
Sounded like complaining to me, like a baby crying when it doesn't want to take a bath.
That was Raven, the black-cloaked dagger woman who commonly joined her father on excursions. She was fiercely known as the best tracker and hunter in Arrenhall, said to have various hideaways in and around the wooded areas of the kingdom. Raven preferred to sleep in a natural burrow over the comforts of a bed or a man-made room. Not to mention, she turned men's knees weak with her jet-black hair, black leather vestments and sultry eyes.
Yes, right, Prodos retorted. The lady who lives in the shadows knows about common phrases and terms of modern societies. There's a laugh.
No one laughed at the remark.
Father, if this woman is your sister, then why have none of us met her?
Kyla asked from the right flank of her father. She used to be my sister. You haven't met her because she hasn't been necessary till now.
What do you mean, necessary?
Kyla prodded again. She is more creature than human. Her mind and soul have linked with the forest in a way that has made it hard to recognize her as kin anymore. I'm half expecting she will think I am a deer and you all a pack of squirrels whence we talk to her in her hole.
Does she actually live in a hole? Prodos said, as if he'd smelled something foul.
Not far from it. Save your questions for the way home, you 3. I imagine you'll have far more to ask once we've had a conversation with her.
Just one more,
Kyla said as they neared the tree line. She took a silence to mean she should continue.
What's her name?
The king rode a few more paces, thinking carefully before he answered. It used to be Nessa. She had a soft voice and a gentle heart, curly hair and a smile as bright as the sun. But her time in the forest has changed her in a way I can't explain. You must see it for yourself to understand.
She's a druid,
Raven interjected, one with the forest. Not unlike Zorion's connection with the spiritual elements of the world. She is in tune with all the subtleties of the forest. Your father paints her in a bad light. Forgive the opinion, my king. Perhaps you're right. Go on. The king waved at Raven with a loose wrist. People of the forest know her as Moriah,
the silent witch. Kyla felt a shiver run down her spine, like a parade of black ants. You're taking us to see a witch? Prodos practically jumped off his horse. If I felt there were any danger, do you think I'd bring you all along? Prodos mulled that over. Raven went on. Don't fear the word. She's more motherly than wicked, though I can't deny she speaks in riddles. All women speak in riddles. Sir Dallow spoke up from the rear guard. His long greatsword nearly touched the ground by his horse's ankles. Oh, I imagine to you they do, Sir Dallow. Raven pushed off her saddle and twisted round. She leaned back on the horse's mane and raised her feet at the broad-shouldered man from Dormouth, smiling at the laughter she received from the others in their riding party. Only after they've had a night with me, you sweet nightingale of the woods. If you give me a chance tonight, I'll have you speaking like the old sand snakes in Naras, when they drink venom of the black tongue before they sing songs to Father Te. This got a much bigger laugh from the entourage. In a move so fast Kyla could barely see it, Raven pulled and twirled a small dagger in front of her eyes, biting her lip playfully back at Sir Dallow. I'd rather pleasure myself with this. That's quite enough, the king boomed into the trees, as the company was swallowed by the deep green canopy of Greenlake Forest. There are foul things at work in the world. I'd prefer to hear them coming. Raven turned back around in her saddle. A blanket of quiet fell over the company. After some time pressing through the trees with nothing more than the sounds of birds and horses breathing to fill the silence, Kyla spotted a structure among the trees up ahead. The home of her half-aunt was not much more than branches, leaves and dirt, stuck together as a sort of multi-layered labyrinth of the forest. It was carefully constructed to resemble a hut. There was no door, just a hole in the centre of the lopsided mass. A steady plume of smoke slipped out of a slanted rock chimney in the back. Kyla wasn't as focused on the home as she was on her peripherals. There was something stirring in her chest. It wasn't an uneasy feeling, but it wasn't welcome either, as though she couldn't quite tell if it was the wind or an animal or something else entirely. She thought she heard a voice thrumming in the space between the trees. It wasn't human. Of that she was certain. It was part whisper, part moan, part whine, as if a woman had been stuck inside a hole just outside the fabric of reality, and her voice was clawing its way back into the forest. The Princess of Arrenhal had learned as a child not to question her father's judgment in front of others. But as they got closer to the dilapidated hut, she couldn't help but feel like her father had made a terrible mistake.
The Forgotten King was created and written by Michael Stagliano. Story by Michaela Oberhofer, El Silito, Matthew Pajad, Maisie Foat, Matthew O'Connell, and Stephen Stagliano. Voice narration by Kitty Liddon. Sound design and scoring by Chris Kirk. Produced by Greg Wood and Emil Hanton.